The great hall of the Galactic Council stood silent as a tomb, and Ambassador Tylan Voss walked toward the podium with the weight of an entire civilization pressing down on his 4 shoulders. He was tall even by Rithali standards, his pale blue skin marked with the silver lines of age and worry, and his 4 arms hung at his sides like they had forgotten how to move with purpose. He had not slept in 9 days, and it showed in every slow and heavy step he took across that polished floor. Around him, the chamber rose in enormous tiers, filled with representatives from over 200 species. The Drexi sat in their hovering platforms, with their cold black eyes, watching everything and feeling nothing. The Sulani coiled in their liquid tanks, their bioluminescent bodies flickering with quiet conversation. The Torvathi perched on their high seats with their razor beaks clicking in boredom. None of them wanted to be here. At the highest tier sat Grand Arbiter Zolan, the head of the Galactic Council, a Drexi male whose face had never once shown emotion in over 40 years of political service. His long fingers were folded neatly in front of him, and his expression said everything without saying a word. This was a formality, nothing more. Tylan reached the podium and placed 2 of his hands flat against its surface to steady himself. He looked out across the chamber and saw what he had feared most: indifference. He began to speak. "Honored members of the Galactic Council," he said, and his voice echoed through the vast space with a tremor he could not hide. "I come before you not as a diplomat, but as a voice for the dying. My people, the Rithali, are being exterminated." He paused, hoping the word would land with the force it deserved, but the chamber barely stirred. "The hegemony of Ashk has declared a war of total annihilation against us," he continued. "Their warships burn in the skies above our homeworld. Our fleet is gone. Our colonies have fallen one by one like candles in a storm. We have lost 11 billion souls in the last 90 days alone." A murmur passed through the lower tiers, but it was the murmur of discomfort, not of outrage. Species shifted in their seats, the way people do when they hear something unpleasant and wish to move past it quickly. Tylan pressed on, his voice growing stronger, even as his hearts broke inside his chest. "For 300 years, the Rithali have served this council and this galaxy with everything we had. When the Orion Corridor Wars displaced 80 million refugees, it was Rithali ships that carried them to safety. When the Sulani Reef Plague threatened to wipe out an entire species, it was Rithali scientists who developed the cure and gave it away for free. When famine struck the outer colonies of the Torvathi Reach, it was Rithali grain that kept their children alive." He looked directly at the Sulani delegation, and they dimmed their lights and looked away. He looked at the Torvathi delegation, and they turned their beaks downward in silence. "We never asked for repayment," Tylan said quietly. "We never asked for favors, or alliances, or special treatment. We helped because we believed that is what civilized species do. We believed that kindness was not weakness, that generosity was not foolishness, that when the time came, the galaxy we had served would remember us." He let the silence hang for a long moment. "The time has come," he said, "and I am asking you to remember." Grand Arbiter Zolan leaned forward slightly and spoke in that flat, emotionless tone that had ended more hopes than any weapon ever built. "The Council recognizes the suffering of the Rithali people," Zolan said. "However, the hegemony of Ashk represents a significant military power, and direct intervention would pose unacceptable risks to galactic stability and trade. The Council will issue a formal protest and establish a humanitarian monitoring committee to observe the situation." Tylan stared at him. A formal protest, a committee. His people were being slaughtered by the billions, and the galaxy was offering paperwork. "A formal protest," Tylan repeated, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Warlord Keth Vorak is burning our cities to glass, and you offer him a letter of disapproval. The council has spoken, Solon said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, which somehow made it worse. It was simply the sound of a machine processing an outcome. Tyelen looked around the chamber one last time. He looked at every delegation, every species, every face and every eye, and every set of mandibles and tentacles and scales. He searched for one single sign of courage, one spark of outrage, one being willing to stand and say that this was wrong. He found nothing. The delegations began to file out, their conversations already shifting to trade disputes and border negotiations. The Rithali extermination was already fading from their minds, like an unpleasant smell carried away by the wind. Tyelen stood alone at the podium in the emptying chamber, his 4 hands gripping the edges so tightly that the wood cracked beneath his fingers. He had come here with the last hope of his species, and the galaxy had treated it like an inconvenience. He closed his eyes and thought of home. He thought of the silver forests of Rythel 4, where his children had played among the singing trees. He thought of the great libraries of Voskathari, where his ancestors had spent centuries recording the beauty of the universe. He thought of the old ones who said that knowledge and kindness were the greatest gifts a species could offer the stars. All of it was burning now. An aide approached him carefully, a young Rythali female named Sora, her eyes red from crying. She touched his arm gently and said, "Ambassador, we should go. There is nothing more to be done here." Tyelen nodded slowly and let her guide him away from the podium. As they walked through the empty corridor outside the chamber, their footsteps echoing in the silence, he spoke without looking at her. "We have no allies, Sora," he said. "In 300 years of service to this galaxy, we have earned exactly nothing. No one is coming for us." Sora said nothing because there was nothing to say. But deep beneath the council building, in a room full of humming machines and blinking lights that no one had visited in years, something small and quiet happened. The Rithali distress signal, broadcast on every official channel as required by council protocol, passed through a series of ancient relay nodes, and one of those nodes carried a frequency code that most species had forgotten existed. It was a code the Rithali had given to a young and struggling species 40 years ago, back when that species had stood before this very council and begged to be accepted into the galactic community. Every other species had voted no. They called the newcomers too aggressive, too emotional, too dangerous, too tribal, too unpredictable. The Rithali had voted yes. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a political calculation. Ambassador Tyelen Voss himself, younger then and full of hope, had simply stood and said, "They deserve a chance. Every species deserves a chance." That single vote had not changed the outcome. Humanity was rejected that day and had to wait another 12 years before gaining provisional membership. But the Rithali vote was recorded, and the frequency code was shared, and a bond was formed that no treaty had ever made official. Now that old signal, carrying the screams of a dying civilization, raced across the void at the speed of light toward a region of space that the rest of the galaxy mostly ignored. The small and unremarkable corner of the Orion Arm, where a species called humans had built their home among the stars. The Rithali had forgotten about the code. Humanity had not. And somewhere in the cold darkness between stars, a receiver woke up, and a light that had been dark for decades began to blink. Lieutenant Priya Okafor was halfway through her 3rd cup of cold coffee when the light on Console 7 started blinking, and she almost ignored it, because Console 7 had not done anything interesting in the entire 2 years she had been stationed at Deep Space Relay Argo 7. Argo 7 was the kind of posting that the United Earth Navy gave to people it wanted to forget about. It was a small metal box floating in the dark at the very edge of human space, crewed by 12 people whose primary job was to watch screens that never changed and run diagnostics on equipment that never broke. It was boring in the way that only deep space could be boring. The kind of boredom that made your bones feel heavy and your thoughts feel slow. But that blinking light was different. Priya set down her coffee and leaned forward, her dark eyes narrowing as she pulled up the signal data on her screen. It was coming in on an old frequency, very old, one that she had never seen active before. She ran it through the identification database and waited, expecting some kind of error or ghost signal bouncing off a dead satellite. Instead, the database returned a match that made her sit up straight in her chair. The signal was Rythali in origin, coming through a diplomatic relay code that had been shared with humanity over 40 years ago. It was an emergency broadcast, and when Priya began to decode it, the contents made her stomach drop. It was a distress call, not a request for trade negotiation, not a bureaucratic memo, not a routine diplomatic ping. It was a raw and desperate cry for help from a species facing total extinction at the hands of the hegemony of Ashk. Priya read the decoded text 3 times to make sure she was not imagining it. Then she hit the priority alert button and sent the signal up the chain with a red flag attached. Within minutes, it was bouncing from relay to relay across human space, climbing the ranks of military intelligence like a fire racing up a ladder. 6 hours later, the signal reached Luna. Fleet Admiral James Hargrove was not a man who showed surprise easily. He had commanded warships for 31 years, survived 4 engagements with hostile species, and buried more friends than he cared to count. His face was carved from decades of hard decisions, and his gray eyes had the look of a man who had seen the worst the universe could offer, and had chosen to keep going anyway. But when he read the decoded Rythali distress signal in his office at United Earth Navy Command, something shifted behind those gray eyes. Something old and deep that he had not felt in a long time. He pulled up the file on the Rythali. It was not a thick file, because humanity's direct interactions with them had been limited. But what was there told a story that mattered. 40 years ago, the Rythali had cast the only vote in favor of humanity's admission to the Galactic Council. It had not been enough to change the outcome, but it had been noticed. The human delegation had sent a formal thank you, and the Rythali ambassador, a younger Tylan Voss, had replied simply, "You deserve a chance. We hope you prove us right." That was not all. 26 years ago, when the human colony on Proxima 3 was hit by a catastrophic crop failure and faced starvation, the Rythali had sent grain ships without being asked. They arrived quietly, delivered their cargo, and left without demanding payment or recognition. 12 years ago, during the Kepler plague that swept through human settlements in the Outer Rim, Rythali medical teams had volunteered to help treat the sick. 3 human hospitals still used Rythali-designed filtration systems that those teams had installed. Every time humanity had been in trouble, the Rythali had shown up, not with grand gestures or political conditions, but with quiet and steady kindness, the kind that most species in the galaxy considered pointless. Hargrove closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. Then he called Secretary General Lian Zhao. Zhao was in her 63rd year, a small woman with sharp eyes and silver hair, who had risen to lead the United Earth government through a combination of intelligence and iron will. She had been a colony administrator, a trade negotiator, and a crisis manager before taking the highest office humanity had to offer. And she understood better than anyone the weight of the decision that was about to land on her desk. Hargrove presented the situation clearly. The Rythali were dying. The Galactic Council had refused to help. The hegemony of Ashk was carrying out a systematic extermination, and humanity had received the distress signal through a channel that most of the galaxy did not even know existed. "What are you asking me, Admiral?" Zhao said, though she already knew. "I am asking for authorization to mobilize the fleet," Hargrove replied. "All of it." Zhao leaned back in her chair and considered the enormity of what he was proposing. Humanity had no treaty with the Rythali. There was no legal obligation, no strategic imperative, no economic incentive. The hegemony of Ash fielded a navy that was larger and more advanced than anything the UEN could put together. Intervening would mean risking the entire military strength of the human species on behalf of someone else's war. "The Council will condemn us," Zhao said. "The Council condemned us for existing," Hargrove answered. "I have never lost sleep over their opinions. The hegemony outnumbers us. They do. We could lose everything: ships, people, our ability to defend our own worlds. Yes, we could." Zhao was quiet for a moment, and then she asked the question that Hargrove had been waiting for. "Why should we do this, James? Give me the reason that I can stand in front of the families of the dead and defend." Hargrove did not hesitate. He had been thinking about this since the moment he read the file. Because 40 years ago, when the entire galaxy looked at humanity and saw something dangerous and disposable, one species stood up for us. They did not do it for money or power or because they had something to gain. They did it because they believed it was right. And every time since then, whenever we needed help, they were there, quietly, without fanfare, without asking for anything in return. He paused and then continued. "If we turn our backs on them now, then every good thing they ever believed about us was a lie. And if we cannot fight for the people who fought for us when no one else would, then we do not deserve the stars we live among." Zhao stared at him through the screen for what felt like an eternity. Then she nodded once. "Do it," she said. "Bring them home." Within the hour, the orders went out across every human world and every military installation in human space. Operation Forgotten Debt was authorized at the highest level, with unlimited resource allocation and priority status above all other military operations. Shipyards that had been running peacetime schedules switched to wartime production overnight. Reserve fleets that had been sitting in orbital storage were activated and crewed. Civilian freighters were conscripted and retrofitted with armor plating and weapons mounts. Retired officers received calls in the middle of the night asking them to put their uniforms back on. And across every colony, on every station, in every city and town and outpost where humans lived, the call went out, not as an order, but as a request. The government told its people what was happening to the Rythali, what the Rythali had done for humanity, and what humanity intended to do about it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers flooded recruitment stations in numbers that had not been seen since the founding wars. Engineers, pilots, medics, soldiers, technicians, people from every walk of life showed up and asked where to sign. On the colony world of New Helsinki, an entire civilian transport company donated its fleet. On Mars, retired shipbuilders came out of retirement to work the yards. On Earth itself, people who had never served a day in their lives lined up to do whatever was needed. The Galactic Council's intelligence networks detected the mobilization within days. Their analysts watched with curiosity as the humans suddenly became very busy, activating reserves, moving ships, and building weapons at a pace that made no strategic sense. But they drew the wrong conclusion. Every model they ran, every historical precedent they consulted, every behavioral algorithm they applied told them the same thing. Humans were preparing to defend their own borders. They were frightened by the hegemony's aggression, and were circling their wagons like the primitive species the galaxy believed them to be. Not a single analyst in the entire Galactic Council considered the possibility that humans were mobilizing to fight for someone else. The idea was so far outside their understanding of how species behave that it did not even appear as a variable in their calculations. They would learn their mistake soon enough. The Aethon Rift was a graveyard of light, a vast stretch of dead space where radiation storms boiled between collapsed stars, and gravity wells twisted the fabric of reality into knots that could crush a warship like paper. No species used the rift as a travel corridor because no species was desperate enough or crazy enough to try. Admiral Hargrove had chosen it for exactly that reason. 2,400 ships moved through the darkness, in a formation so tight that their navigation officers could see the hull lights of the vessels beside them with the naked eye. The fleet stretched across hundreds of kilometers, a river of metal and fire, crawling through the most hostile region of space, between human territory and the Rithali system. It was the longest way around, the most dangerous path, and the only route that would keep them hidden from hegemony sensor networks long enough to arrive without warning. Captain Diego Vasquez stood on the bridge of the UEN destroyer Indomitable and watched the radiation readings climb on his display. The numbers were already in the yellow zone and pushing toward red, and they still had 11 days of transit ahead of them. His ship was not built for this kind of environment. None of their ships were, and every hour in the rift added new damage to hulls and systems that were already stretched thin. "How are the radiation shields holding?" he asked his first officer, a tall woman named Chen, whose calm expression never seemed to change, regardless of how bad things got. "Holding is a generous word, Captain," Chen replied. "I would say they are surviving. Power draw is 40% above normal, and we are burning through our backup capacitors faster than projected. Engineering says we have enough to make it through if nothing else goes wrong." Vasquez almost laughed at that. Nothing else going wrong was not something the Aethon Rift was known for. 3 decks below, Chief Engineer Sonakuri was covered in grease and had not slept in 36 hours. She was aboard the carrier Olympus Mons, the oldest ship in the fleet, a vessel that had been pulled out of a decommission yard and brought back to life with what she privately called prayer and stubbornness. The Olympus Mons had been built 60 years ago, and every one of those years showed. Her power conduits were patched with materials from 3 different ship classes. Her reactor shielding had been reinforced with plates that Kuri had personally cut from the hull of a scrapped frigate. And her main drive had a vibration that Kuri could feel in her teeth every time it fired. But the old ship kept moving, because Kuri would not let her stop. She crawled through a maintenance shaft barely wide enough for her shoulders, replacing a burned-out relay coupling with one she had salvaged from a storage crate that was supposed to contain spare food containers. When supplies ran short, you improvise, and Kuri had been improvising since the fleet entered the rift. Around her, the ship groaned and shuddered as another radiation wave passed over them. The lights flickered, and somewhere deeper in the ship, an alarm started wailing before someone silenced it. "That is the 4th one today," muttered her assistant, a young engineer named Tomas, who handed her tools through the shaft opening with shaking hands. "And we fix it for the 4th time today," Kuri replied without looking up. "This ship is going to make it to Rithal 4 if I have to get out and push her myself." On the bridge of the flagship UEN Ardent, Admiral Hargrove studied the fleet status reports and tried not to let his face show what the numbers were telling him. They had lost 6 ships already, not to enemy fire, but to the rift itself. 2 destroyers had suffered catastrophic reactor failures from the radiation. 1 frigate had been caught in a gravity anomaly that twisted it apart like wet cloth. And 3 support vessels had fallen behind with drive malfunctions so severe that they could not be repaired in transit. Hargrove had ordered the crews evacuated and the ships abandoned. There was no time to stop. Every hour of delay was another hour that the Rithali were dying. He stood at the observation window and looked out at the nightmare landscape of the rift. Clouds of superheated gas glowed in sickly greens and purples, and in the distance, the collapsed remnant of a dead star pulsed with a light that looked almost alive. It was beautiful in the way that a predator was beautiful, something magnificent that would kill you without thought or hesitation. Behind him, his communications officer spoke up. "Admiral, we are receiving reports of low morale on several vessels. Crews are asking questions about the mission, about the odds, about why we are here." Hargrove nodded slowly. He had expected this. These were not all career soldiers. Many of them were volunteers, civilians who had signed up because they believed in something, but who were now trapped in a radiation storm, flying toward a battle they might not survive, all for a species most of them had never met. He turned away from the window and said, "Open a fleet-wide channel. Every ship, every deck, every speaker." There was a moment of silence as the connection was established, and then Hargrove spoke to 2,400 ships and over 200,000 souls. "This is Admiral Hargrove," he began. "I know many of you are wondering why we are here. I know the rift is testing us, and I know that some of you are afraid. You should be. What we are doing is dangerous, and I will not pretend otherwise." He paused and let the silence do its work before continuing. "Let me tell you about the Rithali. 40 years ago, humanity went before the Galactic Council and asked to be accepted as members of the galactic community. Every species in that chamber voted no. They called us aggressive, primitive, dangerous, unworthy. Every species except one. The Rithali voted yes. Their ambassador stood up in front of 200 species that thought we were animals and said that we deserved a chance. He did not do it because we could offer him something. He did not do it because it was popular or safe. He did it because he believed it was right. And that was not the last time. When our colony on Proxima 3 was starving, the Rithali sent grain ships and asked for nothing in return. When the Kepler plague was killing our people in the Outer Rim, Rithali doctors came to help and stayed until the job was done. Every single time we needed help, and the rest of the galaxy looked away, the Rithali were there. Now they are the ones who need help. Their worlds are burning. Their people are dying by the billions. They went before the same Galactic Council and begged for someone to stand with them, and the galaxy turned its back. The same way it turned its back on us. But we are not the galaxy. We are human, and where we come from, when someone stands for you, you stand for them. That is not a treaty, or a law, or a calculation. It is who we are. The Rithali did not help us because it benefited them. They helped us because they believe that kindness matters. If we do not answer that belief, then we do not deserve the name we carry. If we cannot cross this darkness for the people who crossed it for us, then we have no business being out here among the stars. He let the words settle across every ship in the fleet. I am not ordering you to be brave. I am telling you that you already are. You volunteered for this. You left your homes and your families because something inside you said that this was worth fighting for. Trust that feeling. It is the best part of you. We will get through this rift. We will reach Rithal 4, and when we arrive, the hegemony of Ashk is going to learn what happens when you threaten the friends of humanity. The channel closed, and for a long moment there was silence across the fleet. Then, aboard the Indomitable, Captain Vasquez heard something he did not expect. Not the polished, disciplined response of trained soldiers, but the raw and honest sound of people who had just remembered why they were here. The same sound echoed across the fleet, from the smallest corvette to the oldest carrier, from engine rooms and medical bays and crew quarters, where people had been sitting in the dark, wondering if they would ever see home again. Meanwhile, at the other end of the galaxy, the Rithali were running out of time. Warlord Kethvorak's forces had broken through the last orbital defense ring around Rithal 4, and his bombers were turning the surface into ash. The Rithali government had retreated underground, and Ambassador Tyelen Voss sat in a concrete bunker, surrounded by the last survivors of his diplomatic corps. He recorded a final message on an open frequency, knowing that the galaxy would hear it, and knowing with equal certainty that the galaxy would do nothing. This is Ambassador Tyelen Voss of the Rithali people, he said, and his voice was calm in the way that only absolute despair could make a person calm. Our world is falling. Our people are dying. We have asked the galaxy for help, and the galaxy has chosen silence. We do not blame you. Perhaps we were foolish to believe that kindness would be remembered. To whoever hears this, we were here. We tried to be good. We hope that was enough. He ended the transmission and sat in the dark, listening to the distant sound of bombs falling above him. He did not know that his words had been heard by a fleet of 2,400 human warships pushing through the worst stretch of space in the known galaxy. He did not know that Admiral Hargrove had played that message to his entire fleet, and that grown soldiers had wept at their stations. He did not know that the humans were coming. And far away, in the war room of his massive flagship, Warlord Keth Vorak reviewed an intelligence report about the human fleet's trajectory and laughed. His officers had tracked the human ships entering the rift and calculated their destination, but the warlord dismissed it with a wave of his armored hand. "Humans," he said with contempt, "let them come. They are primitives flying scrap metal. Send 300 ships to block the system entrance and continue the bombardment. Rythal IV will be dust before they ever arrive." His officers obeyed without question. It would be the worst mistake of Keth Vorak's long and bloody career. The 300 ships of the Hegemony Screening Force held their position at the edge of the Rythal system with the lazy confidence of predators who had never been challenged. Their captains had been told to expect a small and disorganized human fleet, perhaps a few hundred ships at most, stumbling out of the Aethon Rift half dead from radiation and barely able to fight. They were not prepared for what actually came. At exactly 1400 hours Galactic Standard Time, the darkness at the edge of the system began to tear open. First, there were 10 flashes of light as the forward scout ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and the Hegemony sensors registered them with mild interest. 10 ships, nothing to worry about. Then there were 100, then 500. Then the entire horizon lit up like a sun being born. 2,400 human warships emerged from FTL in a single synchronized wave. Their arrival so perfectly timed that the wall of light they created was visible from the surface of Rythal 4 itself. Destroyers and frigates and cruisers and carriers and battleships and converted freighters and ships so old they should have been in museums, all of them pouring out of the void in a formation so dense that the Hegemony sensors could not even count them all at once. The screening force commander stared at his display and said nothing for 3 full seconds, which in combat was an eternity. Then he opened a channel to Warlord Keth Vorak's flagship and said the words that would echo through galactic history. "Warlord, the humans are here. All of them. They brought everything they have." Before Keth Vorak could respond, Admiral Hargrove gave his first order. "All ships, weapons free, clear the path." The human fleet hit the screening force like a hammer hitting glass. The 300 Hegemony ships were more advanced individually, their weapons more powerful, their shields more sophisticated, but they were outnumbered 8-1, and the humans did not fight the way the galaxy expected. Galactic navies fought at range. They maintained careful distances, fired calculated volleys, and retreated when the odds shifted against them. It was civilized, predictable, and rational. Humans were none of those things. The UEN destroyers surged forward at maximum burn, closing the distance so fast that the Hegemony gunners could not track them. They dove into the gaps between enemy ships and fired at point-blank range where shields were weakest. Frigates worked in wolf packs of 4 and 5, coordinating their attacks with a speed and aggression that the Hegemony tactical computers could not model, because no species in their database had ever fought like this. Captain Vasquez drove the Indomitable straight at a Hegemony cruiser 3 times his size, firing every weapon he had, while his helmsman screamed course corrections, and his damage control teams fought fires on 2 decks simultaneously. A Hegemony beam weapon tore through his port armor and killed 11 of his crew. But the Indomitable kept coming, and her torpedoes found the cruiser's reactor housing and ripped it open from the inside. The screening force broke in 11 minutes, not defeated slowly through attrition, but shattered by the sheer violence and speed of the human assault. The surviving hegemony ships scattered, and the path to Rythal 4 was open. But the real battle was still ahead. In orbit above the Rythali homeworld, warlord Keth Vorak stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Ashkari Dominion, a vessel so massive that it carried its own escort fleet inside its hangar bays. He was a creature built for war, 8 feet tall, covered in natural armor plating the color of burnt iron, with 4 eyes that burned like hot coals and hands that had personally crushed the throats of 3 rival warlords on his rise to power. He watched the tactical display as the human fleet reformed after destroying his screening force and began its advance toward the planet. His intelligence officers were updating their estimates in real time, and every update made the situation worse. "How many ships?" he demanded. 2,362 combat-capable vessels, his tactical officer replied. "We estimate they lost approximately 40 in the engagement with the screening force. The remainder are advancing in a crescent formation at attack speed." Keth Vorak stared at the display. He had 1,600 ships in orbit, more than enough to destroy any conventional fleet, but the humans were not behaving conventionally. They were accelerating toward his formation at speeds that suggested they had no intention of stopping or maintaining safe engagement distances. They were going to ram straight into his lines. "They are insane," his first officer whispered. "No," Keth Vorak said slowly. "They are angry. There is a difference. The insane are unpredictable. The angry are predictable. They will keep coming until they are dead, or we are." He ordered his fleet into defensive formation around Rythal 4, pulling his ships into a tight sphere that would force the humans to attack from multiple angles and spread their forces. It was a sound tactical decision based on centuries of galactic naval doctrine. It did not work. The human fleet split into 4 battle groups as it approached, each one targeting a different section of the hegemony sphere. Admiral Hargrove commanded the center group personally, driving the Ardent and her escorts straight at the heart of the enemy formation, while the flanking groups swept around to attack from the sides and rear. The battle became a storm of fire and metal and death. Hegemony beam weapons carved through human ships, and human missiles and railguns tore through hegemony shields. Explosions bloomed in the darkness like terrible flowers, each one marking the death of a ship and everyone aboard her. The carrier Olympus Mons took a direct hit from a hegemony battleship that ripped open her flight deck and killed 200 crew in an instant. Chief Engineer Kuri, bleeding from a gash on her forehead, sealed the breach with emergency bulkheads and rerouted power from the damaged sections to keep the ship's weapons online. The Olympus Mons kept fighting. A wolf pack of human frigates targeted a hegemony dreadnought and swarmed it from every direction, pouring fire into its shields until they collapsed, and then driving their shots into its weapons arrays and engine blocks. The dreadnought, blinded and crippled, drifted out of formation and was finished off by a volley of torpedoes from a passing cruiser. Human bomber wings, small fast attack craft launched from the carriers, flew suicide suppression runs against hegemony capital ships, drawing their point defense fire away from the larger vessels and paying for every second of distraction with their lives. One bomber pilot, her ship already on fire and losing atmosphere, aimed her craft at the bridge of a hegemony cruiser and accelerated to maximum speed. The impact destroyed them both. The cost was staggering. Human ships were dying by the dozens, their crews burning and bleeding and suffocating in the vacuum. But they did not stop. They did not retreat. They did not even slow down. On the surface of Rythal 4, in the bunker where the last of the Rythali government huddled in the dark, a young communications officer stared at her screen and tried to understand what she was seeing. The orbital sensors, The few that were still functioning were detecting a massive battle above the planet. But the transponder codes made no sense. "Ambassador," she said, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. "Ambassador Voss, I am reading human transponder codes in orbit. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them." Tylen Voss looked at her as if she had spoken in a language he did not understand. "That is impossible," he said. "I have confirmed it 3 times, she replied. "They are UEN military codes. Ambassador, the humans are here. They are fighting the hegemony in our orbit right now." Voss stood slowly, his 4 hands shaking. Around him, the other Rithali were staring at the officer's screen with expressions of total disbelief. "How many ships?" Voss asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. The officer looked at her readings again and swallowed hard before answering. "All of them, Ambassador. They sent all of them." Voss's legs gave way and he sank to the floor. Tears ran down his blue skin, and he pressed his hands against his face and wept. Not from sadness, but from something so powerful it had no name. A feeling that lives somewhere between gratitude and grief and wonder. Above him, the battle raged on. The hegemony fleet was being pushed back, not by superior technology or numbers alone, but by the sheer relentless fury of an enemy that refused to accept defeat. Every time the hegemony destroyed a human ship, 2 more took its place. Every gap in the human lines was filled before the hegemony could exploit it. Keth Vorak watched his tactical display turn from green to yellow to red, and felt something he had not felt in decades of warfare: uncertainty. He opened a direct channel to the human flagship and spoke. "Human Admiral," he growled. "I am Warlord Keth Vorak of the Hegemony of Ashk. Explain yourself. What treaty binds you to the Rithali? What do they offer you? What do you gain from this madness?" Hargrove's voice came back across the channel, calm and hard as iron. 40 years ago, when no one in this galaxy would stand for us, the Rithali stood. They asked for nothing. They expected nothing. They simply believed we deserved a chance. You want to know what we gain? We gain the right to look ourselves in the mirror. Now get away from our friends. The transmission was broadcast on every frequency in the system. Hegemony ships heard it. Rithali survivors heard it. Galactic Council monitoring stations heard it. It was recorded by a dozen different species and would be replayed across the galaxy for centuries to come. Keth Vorak closed the channel and stared at the tactical display where his fleet was dying. For the first time in his life, the warlord gave the order to retreat. The hegemony fleet pulled away from Rithal 4 like a wounded animal, dragging itself into the dark. Ship after ship turned and burned for open space, their engines flaring bright against the black as they fled a battle they had never imagined losing. Warlord Keth Vorak's flagship, the Ashkari Dominion, was the last to leave, and its hull was scarred with the marks of human weapons, long black burns and jagged holes that would serve as a permanent reminder of the day the warlord had learned what it meant to underestimate humanity. Hargrove did not pursue. He had won the battle, but his fleet had paid a price that would echo through human history for generations. 814 ships destroyed, over 30,000 men and women dead, hundreds more wounded, burned, irradiated, or drifting in escape pods among the wreckage. The battlefield around Rithal 4 was a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen bodies, and the light from burning hulls cast long shadows across the planet's surface, like the ghosts of everyone who had given their lives to reach this moment. Admiral Hargrove stood on the bridge of the Ardent and looked at the casualty reports. And for the first time in the entire operation, his composure cracked. He turned away from his officers and pressed his hand against the observation window and closed his eyes. And no one on the bridge said a word, because they understood that even the strongest people have limits. The fleet held position in orbit, as the silence after battle settled over everything like snow. Then, slowly, something began to happen below. On the surface of Rithal 4, hatches opened in the scorched ground, and Rithali ships began to rise. Not warships, because those were all gone, but medical frigates and transport vessels and rescue craft, battered and patched together from whatever was left. They rose through the smoke and ash of their burning world and climbed toward the human fleet above. The first Rithali ship to dock with a human carrier was a medical frigate called the Gentle Hand, and its crew did something that stunned every human who witnessed it. They came aboard and immediately began treating the wounded human sailors, not their own people, not the Rithali survivors who were suffering below, but the humans who had come to save them. A human medic tried to redirect them, saying that they should tend to their own people first, and the Rithali doctor, a small female with silver-green skin and 4 hands that moved with extraordinary precision, looked at him with enormous dark eyes and said, "You came across the stars for us. The least we can do is bandage your wounds first." It was such a small thing, but the human medic had to turn away because he could not stop the tears from coming. Word of this spread through the fleet within hours, and it did something that no speech or order ever could. It reminded every surviving human exactly why they were here and exactly what kind of people they had fought to protect. Ambassador Tyelen Voss was brought up from the surface on a transport shuttle that had to dodge debris from the battle just to reach orbit. He was thin and exhausted, and his blue skin was pale with dehydration. And when he stepped aboard the Ardent, he moved like a man walking through a dream he was afraid to believe in. Admiral Hargrove met him in the shuttle bay, and the two stood facing each other for a long moment. The human admiral with his gray eyes and battle-worn face, and the Rithali ambassador with his 4 arms hanging limp at his sides, and tears already falling. "Admiral," Voss said, and his voice broke on the word, "I do not understand. We had no treaty. We had no agreement. We had nothing to offer you. Why did you come?" Hargrove looked at this alien who had once cast a single vote for humanity when no one else would, who had sent grain to starving human children and doctors to dying human colonies, and who had done all of it without ever expecting anything in return. "Because you were kind to us when it cost you nothing and benefited you less," Hargrove said simply. "That is the rarest thing in the universe. We protect that." Voss closed all 4 of his eyes and lowered his head, and his whole body shook with a grief and gratitude so deep that it seemed to come from the very core of his being. Hargrove stepped forward and placed a hand on the ambassador's shoulder, and they stood like that in the shuttle bay while the wreckage of the battle drifted past the windows. 2 species, 2 strangers, connected by a bond that no treaty had ever created and no war could ever break. In the days that followed, the galaxy watched and reckoned with what had happened. The Galactic Council was thrown into chaos. The footage of the human armada arriving at Rithal 4, 2,400 ships dropping out of FTL in a wall of light, was broadcast on every news network and communications channel in the galaxy. It was watched by trillions of beings across hundreds of worlds, and it became the most viewed recording in galactic history within a single day. But it was not the battle footage that shook the galaxy to its foundation. It was Hargrove's words. "You want to know what we gain? We gain the right to look ourselves in the mirror. Now, get away from our friends." Those words burned through every diplomatic channel and every political debate and every quiet conversation in every species government. They were simple words, spoken in simple language, and they carried a weight that no amount of political maneuvering could match, because they were true, and everyone who heard them knew it. Grand Arbiter Zolan faced a crisis unlike anything in his career. Across the galaxy, citizens of every species were demanding to know why their governments had done nothing while the Rithali burned, The Sulani people, whose species had been saved by Rithali medicine, erupted in protests so massive that their government was forced to send an entire medical fleet to Rithal IV within a week. The Torvathi, whose colonies had been fed by Rithali grain, sent reconstruction materials and engineering teams. Even the Drexi, the coldest and most political species in the council, quietly dispatched supply ships after their own population began expressing what Drexi analysts could only describe as irrational empathic response. One by one, the species that had turned their backs began to come forward, not because the council ordered them to, but because their people demanded it. The sight of humanity bleeding and dying for a species that had simply been kind had awakened something in the galaxy that centuries of diplomacy and trade agreements had never touched. Humanity did not gain territory from the battle. They did not claim Rithali space, or demand resources, or negotiate favorable trade deals. They did not even ask for repayment of the staggering costs of Operation Forgotten Debt. When the Galactic Council offered to compensate Earth for its losses, Secretary General Zhao declined with a statement that was as short as it was devastating. "Kindness is not an invoice," she said. "We did not come to collect." What humanity gained instead was something that no fleet could win and no weapon could create: moral authority. In a galaxy where every relationship was built on calculation and every alliance was built on mutual benefit, humanity had done something that defied every model and every expectation. They had gone to war for no other reason than because someone had been good to them, and they wanted to be good in return. It terrified the powerful and inspired everyone else. In the months that followed, 11 species formally requested diplomatic ties with Earth. 6 of them had previously voted against humanity's admission to the Council. 3 of them had publicly called humans dangerous and unfit for galactic society. All of them now sent ambassadors to Earth with the same quiet request: to be humanity's friend. On Earth, in a park outside the United Earth Government headquarters in Geneva, a memorial was built. It was a simple wall of black stone, and on it were carved the names of every person who had died in Operation Forgotten Debt. Over 30,000 names in neat rows that stretched the entire length of the garden. There were no statues, no grand monuments, no heroic imagery, just names, because Secretary General Zhao had insisted that the people mattered more than the symbols. The dedication ceremony was held on a cool morning in early spring, and the garden was filled with humans and Rithali standing side by side. Ambassador Tyelen Voss was there, his health slowly returning, his forearms folded in the Rithali gesture of eternal gratitude, a posture his species held only for those who had saved their lives. Secretary General Zhao walked to the wall and placed her hand flat against the stone. She stood there in silence for a long time, reading the names, feeling the weight of every single one. Somewhere in those rows was the name of the bomber pilot who had flown her burning ship into a hegemony cruiser. Somewhere was the name of the young engineer on the Olympus Mons who had died sealing a breach. Somewhere were the names of 11 crew members from the Indomitable who had been killed by a beam weapon that tore through their ship while they fought to protect a people they had never met. Behind her, Voss stood in silence, and beside him stood representatives from 11 other species who had come, uninvited, to pay their respects. The Solani delegate glowed softly in their containment suit. The Torvathi representative bowed their razor beak in a gesture of mourning. Their species had not performed for an outsider in 400 years. Even a Drexi observer was present, standing rigid and still, their black eyes fixed on the wall of names. No one spoke. No words were necessary. The galaxy had believed for millennia that compassion was a flaw, that loyalty without profit was stupidity, that no species would bleed for another without a contract signed in triplicate. They had built their civilization on calculation and self-interest, and it had worked well enough to keep the peace, but not well enough to produce a single act of true courage when it mattered most. And then humanity had crossed a graveyard of dead stars, lost 800 ships and 30,000 lives, and fought a war they had no obligation to fight, all because a quiet, gentle species had once raised a hand and said, "They deserve a chance." The galaxy would debate the meaning of it for centuries. Scholars would write about it. Philosophers would argue about it. Military strategists would study it. Politicians would try to claim it. But the truth was simpler than any of them could capture in their analysis. Kindness had been given. Kindness had been returned. And in the space between those two acts, the entire galaxy had changed. Zhao stepped back from the wall and turned to face the crowd. She did not give a speech. She simply nodded once at Ambassador Voss, and he nodded back, and that was enough. In the silence of that garden, standing before the names of the dead, two species, one ancient and one young, one gentle and one fierce, stood together and proved that the most powerful force in the universe was not a weapon or a fleet or an empire. It was the simple, stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to abandon the people who believed in you. And the stars, cold and ancient and indifferent to the small lives that burned beneath them, shone just a little brighter that day, or so it seemed to everyone who was there.